Hello and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Claudia Varna, and I'm a research fellow in RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Group. I'm really pleased to welcome you today to what promises to be a really interesting event, focusing on the challenges that the financing of far-right extremism and terrorism poses to the counter-terrorist financing, or CTF, regime as it stands today. This event is part of a series of webinars and discussions that we've hosted here at RUSI about a wide range of issues relating to the far-right threat. And this event series developed out of a cross-RUSI initiative, the Far-Right Extremism and Terrorism, or FRET, research program. And in the context of this program, we're looking at far-right extremism as a cross-cutting issue. And we're looking at the implications that this threat has for different research groups across RUSI. We're leveraging the expertise of our many experts and teams at the Institute to really explore the whole spectrum of this threat. And as part of this program, we've already looked at far-right extremism, terrorism as a transnational challenge, with different expressions of extremist narratives in different countries, and with online and finance dimensions that really connect this threat and these groups and networks on a global scale. And we've also looked at the role of narratives around gender, including anti-LGBTQ+ narratives, and also narratives around the environment and climate change in far-right ideologies. We've looked at the threat of far-right extremist sentiments in security forces, both in the UK and elsewhere. And we've also looked at the rise of far-right extremism in places like Latin America. And we have a lot of resources on all these topics, as well as event recordings on our website. And I'd also just like to note that this event today is also on the record. So we're live streaming on various platforms, and the recording will be available online as well. So you can have a look at all of that later, but now we're here to discuss far-right financing, and it is an absolute honor to introduce our two fantastic discussants for today. So firstly, we have Stephen Reimer, who's a senior research fellow at RUSI's Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, or CFCS, where he specializes on countering the financing of terrorism and also threat finance more generally. He recently published a paper titled Nearsighted on Far-Right Financing, Why We Need a CTF Rethink. And this paper will really provide the basis for today's discussion. And then we're also joined by Gonzalo Saiz, who is a research analyst at CFCS, working on sanctions and counter-threat finance, including also the countering of the financing of terrorism. So I'll hand it over to the two specialists, Gonzalo and Stephen, for what I'm sure will be a very rich discussion about the limitations of the current CTF regime in the context of the evolving terrorist threat landscape, and also potential ways of recalibrating it to really better respond to the threat of far-right financing. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. We're very happy to be here, indeed, with this timely webinar, not only because I just realized it's D-Day today, but because it matches the growing international concerns about the far right and the rise of this extremist movement, especially if they turn violent. So I'm very happy to be here, joined by Stephen, after the publication of his last paper, to discuss this topic. And before we start, I would like to remind our audience that we encourage them to submit questions through the Q&A function. We will leave 25-30 minutes for this for questions at the end, so please feel free to keep them coming and we'll go over them later. So welcome, Stephen. If we should jump into the discussion. As Claudia was mentioning, you just recently published your paper, Nearsighted on Far-Right Financing, Why We Need a CTF Rethink. And I would like this webinar to guide people through the main insights that your paper provides. We have many joining us today, probably motivated by their interest in the growing threat of the far right, but I wonder how many of them have delved into this topic through the lens of terrorist financing that you present. So maybe let's start from the beginning with the most identifiable element, the title. The title of your paper is a call to action, specifically to rethink the counter-terrorist financing architecture in light of the far-right threat. So could you just walk us through what this regime is and where it comes from?
Sure thing. Thanks, Gonzalo. And can I just say before I begin, thanks to Claudia and the Far-Right Extremism and Terrorism Program at RUSI for inviting us to talk about financing and counterterrorism financing in this space. Usually we're talking to counterterrorism financing people about the far right, but now we get to talk to people interested in the far right about terrorism financing. So yes, what is the counterterrorism financing regime? It's a great many things, and I will be perhaps unsatisfactorily simplistic in my description of it for you today. Essentially, after the attacks on 9/11 in the United States, there was global consensus that we needed to devise some sort of mechanism for countering the financing of transnational jihadism. And the best thing that we seemed to come up with at the time was to take our existing toolkit that we had for tackling money laundering or turning the proceeds of crime, primarily drug crime and other revenue-generating crimes, turning those profits clean. We thought, well, we'll use these tools to counter the financing of terrorism. And really, at the time, terrorism in that sense was thought of as the transnational, very kind of global, corporate, hierarchical organization of groups such as Al-Qaeda, who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. And we looked at the financing of that attack and of these types of organizations and devised systems to counter that kind of financing, with the ultimate goal, somewhat ambitious goal, perhaps foolhardy goal, of trying to stop the money entirely. The idea being that if we can prevent Al-Qaeda from raising any sorts of funds, or at the very least, severely reducing their ability to raise and move and store funds, this will prevent their ability to perpetrate another terrorist attack like they did on 9/11. So this regime essentially enlists the private sector to do counterterrorism through several different mechanisms of reporting on suspicious transactions and identifying individuals who might be part of terrorist groups. This system, which has been in place since around the early 2000s, has not really changed much since then, which is perhaps interesting given that the terrorist threat changed almost immediately after September 11th. There's been a little bit of a wiggle room and a little bit of change in relation to kind of the regime's approach to how terrorism financing might occur through the not-for-profit organization sector. And there's been quite a bit of civil society resistance to how the CTF regime impacted that sector. But aside from this, there hasn't been any kind of major changes to the regime overall. And I think one of the most important things to think about with the counterterrorism financing regime is that it itself is sort of ideologically agnostic. It's not really supposed to be responding to the financing of any one particular ideological group. So in this way, the fact that we're having discussions around how counterterrorism financing systems might be used against far-right extremism and terrorism, this is really a political choice that policymakers and practitioners are making. It's not a sort of natural extension or progression of the regime itself. It's ideologically agnostic, but it is interesting that we're now turning to these tools to see how we might counter the far-right threat, which we've all agreed has come to affect particularly countries in North America and in Europe.
Indeed. So going into a bit more detail of the CTF regime that you're describing, you're hinting towards the role of the private sector. So could you tell us a bit more about this crucial role they play in identifying and reporting financial transactions that are thought to be linked to terrorism?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can go into more detail about that because it's really quite important to understanding what counterterrorism financing is. Really, the private sector has been enlisted to do two main things. The first thing is to try and spot what we call suspicious behavior or suspicious transactions. Essentially, if I'm in the compliance department of a financial institution, probably a bank, but it could also be any other kind of obliged organization. Let's say it's like an accountancy firm, or in some places, a lawyer or a law office. I have an obligation to spot suspicious financial activity. So if I'm that compliance officer in the bank, I will use tools such as transaction monitoring tools. I'll be conducting anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing investigations, essentially looking at all the different transactions of my clients, their financial behaviors, and trying to pull out any types of behaviors or transactions that might suggest that they're linked to terrorism financing. And once I've pulled out those transactions or identified those patterns or behaviors, and I develop a kind of potential suspicion that this could be used to finance terrorism, I'm then obligated to report that to what's called the Financial Intelligence Unit. And this is sort of a central government agency within any individual country or jurisdiction that is in charge of receiving this, what we call financial intelligence or financial information related to terrorism from the financial sector, and then producing intelligence packages to then send to law enforcement, which will hopefully then contribute to or initiate a new investigation into terrorism financing. This is about identifying suspicious behavior. We also have an obligation in the private sector to identify potential members of terrorist organizations or individuals who are part of what we call designated terrorist groups. They've been prescribed and listed by a country as being a terrorist organization. And to do this, the private sector is involved in various activities of compliance, such as customer due diligence, where as a private sector, it's my obligation, for example, Gonzalo, to take information about you when you open a bank account, to learn a little bit about your occupation, what kind of income you might have, other bits of identifying information, and then continuously screening that information about my clients against terrorism sanctions lists and other types of sanctions lists. You obviously do this in various other forms of preventing financial crime and implementing sanctions. For example, sanctions that are currently against Russia, you would similarly screen your client list against those types of sanctions lists. And we have a few of them for terrorists and terrorist organizations. And then my job becomes really important if there's a match. So if we identify that, yes, Stephen's tried to open a bank account and he's on a Al-Qaeda terrorism list, it's then important for the private sector to do several things very quickly, which is to immediately freeze my assets, which means don't permit me to take out any of my money, deposit any further money, or transfer funds to a different account, to record every time I might attempt to make such a transaction, and then, of course, to report this sanctions match to the appropriate authorities. So again, overly simplistically, just think about CTF as getting the private sector to do two things: identify suspicious behavior, and also pull out and preclude, essentially, any individual who's associated with a terrorist organization, a designated one, from using my services as a bank. And it's important also to remember that this is an obligatory system. It's not something that banks or financial institutions sign up to. They're required to do it by law.
Thank you. So when you're analyzing these behaviors and the financial needs of these individuals or groups, you choose to divide the far-right financing into operational and organizational spheres. Why do you choose this approach to structure a paper in this way?
Mm-hmm. Thinking about terrorism financing in organizational and operational terms, as a researcher, I find this to be a helpful analytical tool, because oftentimes in this field, I find we're marred by really kind of superficial understandings of terrorism financing. It's the money that terrorists use, and we don't kind of sometimes get any more specific than that. So thinking about operational and organizational financing lets us get very specific about the particular kind of threat that we're talking about, so that we have a better chance of countering that threat. By operational terrorism financing, it's not too complicated. It's essentially the funds that a terrorist or a group would need to carry out a violent attack. And for the great majority of cases, how you procure your weapon is going to be the major operational financing choice. But if it's a larger terrorist organization that's conducting a more sophisticated operation, you might involve things like reconnaissance missions or paying for attackers to, arrive at the attack site or the city where they're conducting their terrorist attack to plan the attack, these types of activities around operational financing. Then we have organizational terrorism financing, which is far broader, involves the financing of more activities. But you can think about it essentially as how a terrorist group maintains its operations, how it continues to exist as a group, because this also requires substantial amount of funds, particularly if they want to be a successful group. You can think about the funds that are needed to produce and disseminate propaganda, also opportunities to recruit individuals to join the organization, and any other types of, might be infrastructure, could be physical infrastructure or infrastructure in the cyber realm, in online websites, safe houses, anything like that that's needed just to keep the organization existing. And I use this frame of organizational and operational in the paper to really try and scrutinize whether the counterterrorism financing regime is suitable at preventing both types of terrorism financing when it comes to the far-right threat. So I look at far-right operational financing and then far-right organizational financing.
And on the operational financing side, how does the nature of attacks by the so-called self-activating terrorists challenge the CTF regime that you are describing?
Self-activating terrorism is a phrase that myself and my colleague, Mr. Matthew Redhead, coined back in 2021, where we were looking at the kind of not far right, but the general lone actor terrorism phenomenon that Europe particularly had been experiencing since the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate. And in that work, we were looking at lone actor terrorism, and it was a really unsatisfying kind of phrase because it sort of suggested that these individuals are acting alone, that they don't have associates or they're not part of wider networks. And we really felt in that research that that was touching on the wrong element of these people. So we settled on self-activating terrorism in order to emphasize a different element, which is that these individuals have what we call operational autonomy. They have the autonomy and the decision-making power to choose what kind of target they're going to attack, what they're going to use to attack it, and crucially, how they're going to use finance to carry out that sort of attack. And in North America and Europe, where I base this research and the paper that we mentioned, self-activators are really the chief far-right terrorist threat that we face, particularly when it comes to the highest risk of violence and threat to life. And it looks a little bit like this. In the far-right kind of world, we find that those self-activators tend to be inspired by an extremist milieu, is the phrase I use. And unlike other types of extremism that we study, this milieu increasingly is online. You could almost say it's almost exclusively online in the far-right world. And this already poses an interesting idea of terrorism financing in the far-right. Could we think about radicalization financing, the financial resources that are used to grow that milieu, to have people online producing content and sharing it and disseminating it, really creating an online space which certain individuals take part in, and only certain individuals are then inspired to carry out a violent attack in the real world. And let's be clear, the self-activator threat is certainly a threat from jihadist terrorism, from Islamist extremism, but it's something else that we also see on the far right side of things. And both ideologies suffer from the same kind of challenges to the CTF regime, which is that to conduct a self-activator attack, it typically is involving very little expenses, so a very low cost of very banal items, so really everyday kind of items. And those finances come from really everyday sources. The banal items can be things like a kitchen knife that's used to stab people on the streets of Paris or London. Could involve the hiring of a rental van, which is something that people do every day just to, move house. And the everyday sources are equally unassuming. Could be someone's wage income. Maybe they're conducting a little bit of benefits fraud. They don't look like terrorism financing in the way the CTF regime imagined terrorism financing would look. Back in the days of Al-Qaeda financing 9/11, you had substantial funds flowing through the international financial system. And that's what the CTF regime is attuned to identifying. It's not attuned to identifying if somebody picks up a kitchen knife at their local Lidl and then conducts an attack with it. So we have the problem of the system not raising those red flags from these types of transactions. And for good reason. It would be untenable if we had a regime that flagged potential terrorism risk every time somebody was renting a vehicle to, as I said, to move house, or every time they went to buy some hydrogen peroxide online, which they could be using for perfectly good reasons, maybe not to purchase or construct an improvised explosive device.
I think you're bringing a lot of clarity to the frustrations that a lot of compliance departments in the private sector feel when they're looking into the case studies of self-activators and, well, how can we stop it? How can we prevent this flow of financing where they are, as you say, banal funds that have a very often legitimate source and they're very hard to disrupt? So moving on to the other sphere, when looking into actual terrorist groups or extremist organizations, you argue that countering the financing of the far right's organizational needs, that suffers from what you call the designations dilemma or the WhackAMole problem. Could you break this down for us and maybe give us an example?
Yeah, I think it might be in our participants' interest. You signed up for a webinar, the image of which was a guy playing the Whack-A-Mole game at an arcade. If you're not familiar with this arcade game, it's a pretty simple concept. You have this large mallet. It's usually a kind of comically large mallet, and you're playing on a board with these little several different holes in a grid, and a little plastic mole will pop out from one of those holes, and you have to whack it with the mallet to get some points. But the challenge with the game, and I think the sort of image that the game is trying to reflect, is that a mole will pop up through one little hole, but then before you can whack it with your mallet, it'll recede back underground, and it will move to a different hole and pop up there, and recede back down and move up into a different hole. And it's a phrase that's kind of meant to articulate and illustrate one of the problems that I saw with designating far-right groups as terrorist organizations, which is that more so than with jihadist groups or other types of other groups motivated by other ideologies, is that far-right groups, in response to designations, tend to dissolve themselves. They tend to abandon their name, abandon their brand, but then really pop up somewhere else under a new name and under a new brand, which then has to be designated as well. So if we think of the designation as the mallet and the far-right group as the little moles popping up from underground, all with different sorts of names and identities. And I can give a really clear-cut example of this to illustrate what I'm talking about. Here in the UK, the government is one of the world leaders in designating far-right groups, and was one of the first countries to designate a group by the name of National Action in December of 2016. This is one of your typical very racist neo-Nazi groups that glorify extreme violence for political and ideological ends. So National Action gets hit by that mallet of designation in 2016. But little under a year later, in September of 2017, we saw that this group reformed, or members of the group recoalesced under a different name called Scottish Dawn, and yet another group called NS131. So the UK government recognized these not as distinct groups, but as aliases or as other names for that group that was designated in 2016, National Action. So then these guys become designated. And then further on, in February of 2020, we have another iteration of the same network, really, the same people, this time calling themselves Systems Resistance Network, which gets added to the list again. So this is quite a challenge, I think, and quite unique to the far right. We don't see groups like, for example, Hamas or Islamic State in Iraq and Syria abandoning their name and brand once they become designated by European or North American governments. It's important because these designations of groups are oftentimes needed to open the counterterrorism financing toolbox. You can't do counterterrorism financing without the terrorism part, and it's up to national authorities to decide who are terrorists and who are not. So it's difficult to freeze funds of organizations unless you're able to make that designation. And unlike some of the jihadist groups and other terrorist organizations that I mentioned, we are far from global consensus, oftentimes even national consensus, on who ought to be on that terrorism list when it comes to the far right. There's jurisdictions such as the United States that, because of their legal framework, have a whole host of other challenges to designating far-right groups. And the United States has a lot to do with the inability to designate a group as a terrorist group if it's wholly domiciled in the United States. So the challenge, the real designations dilemma, or the whack-a-mole problem, as I'm trying to articulate it, has to do with these names and brands, which are the subject of designations, are ditched and left behind, but the networks and the people and the what's really underneath those names and brands, they still remain. And we haven't been able to actually root out the cause of the problem, just the name of them.
You just covered what was going to be my follow-up question to this, which is it seemed like it was going to be the positive step forward to finally get states to take the threat of the far right more seriously, achieve a consensus to designate an organization and put them on the list, And yet we're running into another of the great tactics of this very dexterous groups of the WhackAMole problem, and they just change their designation and wait, sort of wait it out until they get spotted again and their new name is designated. So now that we're covering the particular nature of the financing of the far right, we're discussing the role of the private sector in the traditional CTF regime. So against this, the risks presented by this particular threat in the far right, how would you then rate the private sector's role and response? Are they doing their duty effectively? Does, as you're saying, this traditional CTF lens and the jihadi approach and the duties that they've implemented on the private sector, are they matching what they should be accomplishing against the far right?
Mm-hmm. I think I have quite a bit of sympathy for the private sector. They tend to be our sort of vacuum cleaner component of our counterterrorism regime, kind of generally. When we need something else to be done and there isn't a clear place for it, we ask the private sector to take it on. So I do have quite a bit of sympathy for the place the private sector have been put into. Oftentimes they're told to look for terrorism financing, they're told to look specifically for far-right financing, but oftentimes don't get, I think, sufficient guidance from the public sector as to what precisely they need to be looking for. So are they doing their duty, perhaps, by the letter of the law, but there's certainly more that can be done, by the spirit of the law or the spirit of the regime. I mean, look, lacking kind of more clear government guidance or direction from the public sector, it's very interesting how certain members of the private sector have been taking this matter into their own hands, particularly with the far right threat, which has several unintended consequences and adverse impacts, which I would like to highlight and really hope we can have a discussion about trying to prevent those types of unintended consequences. And here we really start to think about not our traditional financial institutions, but really online spaces for raising funds and also for disseminating information, kind of social media platforms, crowdfunding platforms. These types of private sector actors are really closely linked with the far right threat. We have several different platforms, particularly social media platforms and crowdfunders as well, who will make choices to create their own list of what you might call like designated individuals or designated groups who they say are violating perhaps their community standards, or who, for whatever reason, have some sort of ideological position that platform decides we don't want to have them on our system. And so by maintaining these lists, essentially, it's the platforms and the tech companies and the private sector who are really kind of making the choice between what is hateful ideology or what is possibly merely distasteful rhetoric. And it's somewhat uncomfortable from where I'm sitting to let the private sector kind of make that call as to what is going to be deemed to be speech or activity that is deemed unacceptable and should remain out of the public sphere, and what might be a reasonable quantity of diverse opinion that we may need to have in the public comments. That's a very tricky, distinction to make, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate through silence to let the private sector make that kind of call. Furthermore, when the private sector just decides to deplatform or remove an individual or a group from their service, this very rarely has the effect of expunging that individual or group from the internet or from being able to do what they want to do. It often leads to what we call platform migration. And typically, folks that are deplatformed from major crowdfunding and social media platforms, they tend to move into more opaque places of the internet, meaning that they're still carrying out their activity, but we have less oversight of what that activity actually is. And here we have to say something very briefly about cryptocurrency, because it wouldn't be a terrorism financing webinar if we didn't mention crypto. I would include cryptocurrency in this category of more opaque spaces of the internet. Now, I know what you're going to say. Cryptocurrency and transactions are visible on a public blockchain, unless you're using one of the more less commonly used privacy coins. But I would still classify cryptocurrency of all ilks to still be a more opaque place in the online world, if only because law enforcement agencies, are really around the world. We can't say that any one of them is really doing exceptionally well at training their staff on blockchain analytics. So yes, the information may be publicly available on the blockchain, but it might as well be out of our hands in terms of a law enforcement sort of response. So the private sector's kind of response and approach to this is a bit of a mixed bag. And what I would say is I am quite concerned about some choices that are being made off the back of reputational risk concerns, which subsequently have the implication of causing platform migration, which reduces our ability to really understand what is going on and to collect financial intelligence and financial information about what far-right groups are doing, how they're behaving, and how they're spending funds.
So I think you've broken down really well the deficiencies of the counter-terrorist financing regime and how it's not fitting for the far-right financing threat. So what does the rethink of the CTF regime that you propose, what does it need to accomplish to meet these distinct characteristics of the financing of the far-right?
Mm-hmm. It's a tricky question. It's a big question. And I don't want to just be throwing rocks at glass houses. So there are four sort of general areas that I think the regime needs to focus on, or the sort of stewards of the regime really need to focus on to properly rethink CTF in light of the far right. The first would be about, can we get better at detecting financial behaviors that are indicative of self-activators before a terrorist attack occurs? There's limited utility of that financial intelligence after attack. Sure, it can be used to identify networks and to kind of dig further into the networks of far-right extremists, but it really would be ideal to be able to use finance to prevent terrorist attacks. So can we get better at identifying those financial behaviors before something violent occurs? The second point is about transmitting financial intelligence from the private sector to the public sector. And again, here I talk about, does the private sector properly understand what it is they're meant to be looking for? And are they communicating that intelligence in a timely way? And is it aligned with operational priorities for law enforcement agencies? I think this is a problem that is brought to light by the far right threat, but certainly not specific or only having to do with the far right. It's something that our CTF regime is struggling with, I think, I'd say, across the board. I then would encourage us to look at the limited effectiveness of far-right designations. I don't think that they're certainly not a catch-all solution, and they're certainly not, okay, we've designated the far-right groups, therefore they won't be able to raise any finance. We have to look at the ways in which groups can reform or sort of circumvent those types of designations or sanctions in creative ways. And then the fourth thing I would think the rethink would have to look at is some of those adverse consequences of the private sector's own responses. If the public sector doesn't do more or adjust their response to this threat, the private sector will sort of be forced to take their matters into their own hands, and will have some unintended and adverse consequences as a result, which would then require their own remedy. So
I have a couple of last questions before we open the floor for questions. We see that we're already coming in. So a very important point that you're making is of better informing the private sector of what they can deliver to improve their information collection and sharing with authorities, and then reinforcing this feedback loop where they know what has been useful or not. What are your thoughts on the argument on the sensitivity, especially of the CFT, the related information sharing? Because with anti-money laundering, it is easier to exchange their communication, but there is a concern among some financial intelligence units that some information that could jeopardize investigations into counterterrorism and sharing operationally sensitive information could in the end damage the investigation. So what would be your thoughts to prevent this in this case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's always a bit of anxiety about information exchange and timely and kind of, I'd say, open information exchange. And Gonzalo, you're one of my colleagues at the CFCS, and we know that this is something that we talk about kind of all the time. How do you establish trust between members of the public and the private sector to do that kind of exchange? My thinking on this topic has shifted, I would say, in the last couple of months and maybe even a year or two. I'm starting to lose faith, I suppose, in the idea that we can have the private sector, identify suspicious transactions or what they need to be looking for, on their own accord, and then to sort of fill up the inboxes of financial intelligence units with these reports of suspicious transaction, which may be far and away from the investigative priorities of the police or of intelligence agencies at the time, or they may be so lacking in detail as if to be entirely useless. It might be less about trying to establish trust between these different entities, and perhaps going towards a system that other jurisdictions have taken, whereby real-time, not exchange of information, but pooling of information into sort of you might call them fusion cells, you might call them sort of vetted environments whereby intelligence from the private sector is placed alongside intelligence from other parts of the public sector. It might be from education, health ministries, and I think just putting financial intelligence kind of on the same plane. And then from that point, the public sector being able to make choices about where to place investigative priorities and how to go about identifying terrorism financing risks and threats. It's a view. It's possibly a bit of a controversial view and different way of doing things, but I wonder if the far right threat is showing us how maybe we don't need a CTF kind of rethink, but maybe a CTF overhaul, possibly.
So, last question for me before we move to the Q&A. How well do you think your paper has been received by policymakers and practitioners when you're sharing this kind of thoughts? Do you think it's there's a realistic room for your recommendations to be taken on?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, some of those practitioners and policymakers, I think, are here in the room today. So I hope to hear what they think of the paper and to, offer helpful challenges, because this is an ongoing discussion at the end of the day. I don't purport to have all of the answers. I do think the far right threat does force us to come face to face with the reality of that this whole CTF system is really out of date and is not responding to current challenges and threats to our peace and security, terrorism being one among many of those threats. I do think the recommendations, they are actionable and there are reasonably wide-ranging, and there's a bit of scope to adapt them to national contexts, but I do think they would require some courage. I haven't produced policy recommendations in this paper that can just be slotted into existing systems. I do think it requires kind of radical rethink in certain places about how we use finance to counter threats to our security. And at the core of that, it might even be, we could even start with a simple kind of rethink away from seeing counterterrorism financing as one of many financial crime type issues that we need to deal with. So perhaps this webinar is a very good exercise in doing that. Typically, we're talking to compliance officials and people that deal with money laundering, trying to get them excited about terrorism. Hopefully what we're doing today and what I want our center to focus on in the future is to bring the finance discussion to the security community, to the folks who are interested and engaged with countering the far right because of its threats to security and to our societies.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Well, I have really interesting questions in the Q&A. I'm going to throw one at you that I think it's a good follow-up. So we have cases such as the Proud Boys that have been designated in countries such as Canada and New Zealand, where they are part of their source of revenue are just selling of merchandise using mainstream platforms and financial services. And these are comparatively benign fundraising methods that seem to be overlooked, and but they're very relevant in the end for their financing streams. And they're also overlooked in the usage of mainstream platforms and financial services. So what are your thoughts on how we could respond to those apparently benign sources of financing that they're using?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, Matt's question is getting right to the crux of this. Who decides what is terrorism, what is violent extremism, and what is merely distasteful ideology? I mean, I'm aware of the Proud Boys. I'd put them into hateful and extremist groups that propagate hate and are extremist myself. But it is challenging. I think in some, especially Western democracies, we do have freedom of expression protections, which we want to protect. I think it is difficult for the public sector to decide and to make those calls. It does require quite a bit of, I suppose, political courage. I know in Canada, designating the Proud Boys was something that could probably only happen under the current government there. Same with New Zealand. there's probably reasons that in other jurisdictions, that group hasn't been designated. And unless there's that kind of sort of similar courage, and that courage is brought all the way through from the designation point, which is, that's nice for a politician to say, we're standing up against hate, we're designating the Proud Boys, but then to follow through on that by making sure that, your financial intelligence unit is properly briefed on, what are the types of transactions they can expect to see from this new terrorist organization? And does that courage trickle down as well to the private sector themselves? Are they properly briefed and understand precisely the type of financing threats that could come from that organization? And then the platforms themselves, this is also quite difficult. Some of the mainstream platforms have, so much content and so many different, bits of merchandise that are being sold on their platform every day. They could say, how am I meant to monitor all this all the time? How am I meant to decide if this t-shirt is propagating hate and this t-shirt just kind of is advertising a fringe belief? There are some out there that think the solution to this problem is to just expand the counterterrorism financing regime to include people like online marketplaces, or to include the social media platforms whereby advertisements for the sale of this merchandise can be advertised. That's quite a big ask. It'd be quite a challenge, and I'm not necessarily sure if making more organizations and more entities, obliged entities, is the right solution. But I think until the public sector makes a choice and follows through on it, the private sector, like those platforms, are going to be making this call on their own. And sometimes we might be satisfied with the choice they make, but sometimes we might disagree. There won't be room for redress. There won't be opportunities for a group to say, "Hey, I don't think we should have been we shouldn't have been deplatformed."
Yeah, and we have a question from Jessica Davis that I wonder if it's linked to the choice to maybe refrain from selling just like blatantly extremist products or services, and trying to like camouflage them to be like more accessible. The different types of like the great adaptation that we're seeing on far-right groups overall. So the question is, how much of what we see in extreme right financing do you think is actual adaptation learning to our CTF activities?
This is a good point that Jessica raises. She always raises really great points. I think right at the imposition of the CTF regime after 9/11, we saw groups deciding to not use the formal financial system to the extent that they were to finance those kinds of large attacks. There's a paper that was written by the Norwegian Defense Research Institution, which surveyed kind of what we call the lone actor threat in Europe after 9/11. A little bit before and then after 9/11. And in that research, it shows that almost immediately after 9/11 and the imposition of CTF controls, did groups begin to adapt their behavior so that they would not be caught by those kinds of controls. So, this point is absolutely the case. Terrorists are always adapting and reacting to the controls that we have in place, and are oftentimes innovating in response to impediments that we put in their way. So this is just to underline the fact that we do need a CTF rethink. We can't think that what we were doing in 2001 is going to be applicable to preventing the financing of terrorism in 2023 because of those very adaptations that have been occurring.
Thank you. I also have a bit of a tricky question, but also raises a very interesting point by Nick. Is there a role for civil law in all of this? And so, for example, bankrupting extremist networks and individuals by holding them financially responsible for the harm they've caused? We saw the recent case of Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook families with a massive fine imposed on him, and Tommy Robinson and the Syrian refugee he libeled in the UK as examples.
I was having this discussion with a colleague the other day about the civil law sort of aspect of the CTF regime and charging individuals with terrorism financing or radicalization finance, or whatever it is that would be against the law. Let's use terrorism financing as an example. I think that we do have a system at the moment also in evaluating the effectiveness of our counterterrorism financing regime, which is in the FATF standards. This is the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international standard setter on countering terrorism financing as well as preventing money laundering. I mean, the FATF uses as an indicator of the effectiveness of a country's CTF regime to be how many successful terrorism convictions that country has had. And in some sort of what kind of weird world is it a measure of success for a law if there are many trials that result in a conviction for that law? You know, possibly the result of a good trial is that somebody is found to be innocent. So I think this kind of banking compliance aspect of CTF and role of the private sector, which I'm really focused on today, is somewhat divorced from that civil law response. So I don't in that way feel like I'm in a great position to answer this question. It is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit moralizing as well to decide that you know, you've defamed me through your far right ideological projects, things like this. It feels a little bit outside the realm of the CTF regime, as I understand it. And yeah, there could be a kind of civil society led effort to try and bankrupt the far right through kind of strategic lawsuits in this way, but again, I'm a little bit suspect of any effort to try and bankrupt any type of extremist movement. It seems to be a little bit foolhardy. It hasn't worked in the past with any type of group that I'm aware of, so I'm not too sure how it would work in the future.
Absolutely. Well, we're going back to the point on the private sector and the duties imposed on their compliance departments. And Vito very appropriately asks the question on how some private firms, financial institutions, and specifically, as we're discussing, regulatory compliance specialists and financial crime lawyers argue that educating staff, investing the time and resources to focus on extremist financing, including the far right, is beyond what a financial institution is supposed to be doing in the UK and also abroad. So what are your thoughts on this and the very recurring discussion on overburdening the private sector with this CTF responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point of Vito's question is about supposed to be doing. So like, what are they legally obliged to do? The private sector is obliged to, screen against sanctions lists, and they're meant to identify suspicious transactions and report them. There is all kinds of other things that the private sector could be doing to prevent the financing of extremism, etc., but they may not be obliged to in the law, and they may never be, formally held to account for they can't be held to account for failing to carry out something they're not obliged to do. I mean, financial institutions at the end of the day are trying to make money, and they're trying to keep things like compliance costs as low as possible. So again, we are in a situation where there may be sort of overtures that are made to the private sector about, you can do more, you should do more to prevent radicalization financing, extremism financing. I've heard in various conversations about a moral imperative to prevent the financing of extremism and radicalization. But I mean, let's get real here. Banks are going to do what they're obliged to do by law. And in the vast majority of cases, probably not a hell of a lot more, because it's perhaps very interesting to invest lots of money in your compliance function to do proactive investigations about terrorism, extremism, radicalization, financing. But if you're not actually obliged to, this may just be a few, perhaps, well-endowed organizations, financial institutions rather, doing this. But unless there's no obligation at the public sector level, who's going to force them to do this?
We had also an early question from Jessica, but I think you covered it during your presentation on the rebranding and the WhackAMole problem and how if we've seen it for jihadist groups, even as if you argued at a smaller level, how is it happening in the extreme right space? So maybe to give it a little spin, I would like to add a complication that we've heard throughout the discussion that we've had with law enforcement agencies, which is, what are your thoughts on the challenges posed by the topic of the far right and the discrepancies of what it means and the ideology behind it in achieving international cooperation against its financing and curtail the financing of the far right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and give Jessica a kind of more satisfying answer to her question, because it is fair. I may have perhaps misled or been a bit too kind of clear cut about jihadis don't rebrand and far right groups only rebrand. I mean, of course, different types of terrorist groups rebrand, drop names, pick up names here and there. But it's made me think a lot about the utility of a brand and whether for a particular group and what they're trying to achieve, if their brand has more or less utility in a particular context, and whether in some cases they have an incentive to drop it, and in other cases they have an incentive to retain the brand and weather the consequences of that brand being designated as a terrorist brand. So I've been thinking about with the far right, the relationship. We already talked about merchandise in this discussion, which is important for the far right. The relationship between a brand and the ability to monetize that brand. If you're a far-right terrorist organization that generates quite a bit of funds through selling T-shirts, merchandise, selling tickets or, entrance fees for people to come to a rally or perhaps a musical concert that's got that branding and got that kind of those trappings of the ideology and of the spirit around it. Is it more financially expedient to just quickly create a new brand and get people socialized with that brand, or to hold on to it and just go underground and don't use the formal financial system? I think that's more of a research question that I have for myself and for others than kind of an answer to the question directly. To the point about, the kind of international issue, the lack of a consensus, it's certainly a challenge. And I think maybe we don't appreciate, and we somewhat take for granted, the consensus that we had internationally about transnational jihadism at the time of 9/11, and then I would say again around the ISIS days, the heyday of ISIS. I think that's really the exception as opposed to the norm, and sometimes we might forget that. We might think, oh, well, terrorism is terrorism, and we just have to prevent it. In international fora like the United Nations, they might be well placed to act where there is that international consensus, but there's going to be plenty of cases where that consensus just doesn't exist. Maybe the issues are too geographically pinned, or the issue of far-right extremism isn't seen as an extremist or terrorist ideology internationally. In certain places, it might be seen as a brand of, a counterculture, a brand of nationalism, etc. I don't really have a great answer on how to internationalize the far-right problem. In fact, maybe I'm saying that we need to look at more regional fora or look at just the national level on doing more to counter the financing of those groups, because perhaps that's the space that the threat permits us to work in.
Thank you. Well, we have a last question, but we have a few minutes, so we do welcome people to try to get in a couple more before the end. So we have a question on within transaction monitoring. Can you give examples and/or patterns to look out for regarding CTF? I think this is an important question, since the mode that we try to put out in our work is the differences in trying to look out for money laundering indicators and terrorist financing indicators. So could you give us some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not very comfortable giving answers to this question. I get it in other places as well, because I don't work in the compliance department of a bank. I don't see these types of transactions every single day. So I think it'd be a bit rich for me to say, and you should look for this particular type of transaction amount or going to this particular place. I think the far right threat shows us the actual limitation of these tools like transaction monitoring. They can do some things, but they can't do everything. And I don't think there is an answer to how to identify when I'm purchasing a knife at a supermarket to chop up vegetables versus when I'm using that knife to carry out a terrorist attack. One thing I do think, and that I think is important, is that we maybe lessen our dependence on these types of compliance tools like transaction monitoring. I think it's maybe unrealistic for us to think that we can identify potential terrorist activity through financial transaction data alone. I don't think that's a sufficient, there's insufficient information there from which to decide, yes, this is definitively terrorist activity, or it's likely so, and therefore, we're going to have more investigation into it. I'm much more a proponent of commingling different intelligence streams, including financial intelligence, so that we can get a fuller picture of an individual or of a group and kind of what are their activities and whether we want to dedicate resources to countering the threat that they may pose.
Excellent. Well, we have one final comments. It's not so much a question, but I think it makes an interesting point to what we were discussing earlier on civil law and its possible benefits to counter far-right financing. And I believe the gist of Jill's comment is that putting forth these civil lawsuits that we've seen bankrupting the Ku Klux Klan or against Sinus versus Kessler, there are some positive examples and the information that could be obtained from these cases could also potentially lead to, as she calls, data-driven ways to prevent similar far-right activity in the future. So do you have any thoughts on her comment?
I mean, Jill sounds like she's absolutely an expert, and this is where, their space. I guess I'm just maybe not convinced, but I'm very open to having my mind changed about whether full organizations can really be bankrupted, and that members of that group will decide, okay, well, we're not going to engage in our, furthering our ideology anymore because we can't sort of raise any funds. Like, yes, sort of expensive legal battles can hinder their ability, and yes, being slapped with a terrorism designation could certainly sort of hinder your ability, but it certainly doesn't sort of eviscerate the network. And I think that's what I'm trying to say with the point about the designations dilemma and the WhackAMole problem, is that we can address that sort of superficial level, that kind of the way the threat appears in the material world, but it doesn't actually break up the networks that exist underneath. And so I think if we can use finance as a means of identifying that network and disrupting the network, we can make sure that the WhackAMole mole doesn't pop up in a different place in time. But it's really interesting to hear about these types of civil lawsuit approaches in the United States. Excellent.
Okay, we have the last question for today, and we thank you all for submitting them. I think it's good that we end up also on an ethical note, to which we also always keep in mind when conducting counter-terrorist and counter-terrorist financing discussions. So Bianca is asking, is there a risk of doing too much in terms of CFT and infringing human rights?
That's a big philosophical question in itself. I would challenge saying too much in terms of terrorism financing or counterterrorism financing. It's oftentimes the wrong sort of counterterrorism financing efforts that lead to adverse consequences or the infringement on human rights. I talked a little bit about my concerns about relegating these types of choices to the private sector and how that could affect freedom of speech, freedom of association type rights. That's certainly at play here. But other parts of our work here at the Center on terrorism financing and human rights would also point to kind of growing trends around deliberate attempts to silence or to counteract, or what am I trying to say here? To respond to regime threats coming through the imposition of counterterrorism financing measures onto individuals and groups. So there's certainly ways in which those CTF can be mutated and abused to deliberately target civil society organizations, political opponents. I've seen some recent cases, even in countries such as Canada, and not in what we might call like authoritarian dictatorships, where anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing tools have been used, not trying to impose an authoritarian dictatorship, of course not, but to do things aside from prevent terrorism financing. And I do think that if we do reform the CTF regime, if we do give it that rethink, which I am a proponent of doing, we have to make sure that there's appropriate safeguards in place such that we don't offer useful tools to autocrats or to regimes to suppress dissent or to pursue other threats that have nothing to do with preventing the financing of genuine terrorism. So it's always something we have to keep in the back of our minds and think about, okay, if we adjust this tool, how could it potentially be misused for alternative purposes?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much for the excellent paper and the analysis that you've brought to the discussion today. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and submitting such great questions for discussion. We hope you enjoyed the session today. We want to thank Claudia for hosting and the entire team at the FRED program. And I want to end also plugging the next session, which we invite you all to join us in July. Will be on policing the far right and will be hosted by our colleagues in the organized crime and policing team at RUSI. So for myself, thank you very much for joining us.